Excited to have everyone with us today. Our first session is, I think, a really good kind of back to school season one with thinking about behavior and academic instruction together and intertwined, right? Looking at that integrated and what it looks like to think about both of those together. I am Crystal Cherasani from the Behavior Alliance of South Carolina, and I am happy to be co-presenting with Ashley Plum from the University of South Carolina today. She brings a lot of experience in the integration world in the behavior and academic land, and I'm really excited to have her with us as we present together today. So I'll give you a couple minutes to introduce yourselves. We want to know who is with us in this room today, the virtual room. So if you'll give us just a little bit of intro of your name, role, district, and something you're looking forward to this year as we kick off the new school year.
I guess I'll start. My name is Shakita Glenn. I'm a behavior interventionist currently working for the Chester County School District. Something I'm looking forward to this year is actually being still continue to be an advocate for the kids and working
Yes.
with them as far as behavior and other challenges that they may have as far as behavior or behavioral. Um,
Yes, thank you for especially shouting out being an advocate for the students. I think that's the reason we're all here today when we think about this work. So I'm excited to hear you excited for that this year. That feels good. That's really good. All right, I see we've got several in the chat. Jennifer's with us, Sarah McKay. Shannon, thank you so much for looking forward to meeting new students. I like that too. That's always that refreshing first day vibes or that beginning of the school year. I always laughed and joked that it's like the honeymoon period in the beginning because they're all coming in on their best behavior. So fun. Looking forward to the new year. Building new relationships. Yes. All right. Let's see what else we have. I love it. Implementing a school-wide behavior matrix. That is very exciting. In Pickens, I see you. All right, very good. Let's see. Looking forward to being an advocate again for the students. That does my heart so good. Working in two new schools this year. Very good. Seeing students. I love this. Thank you guys for sharing. I can't go through all of them, but it makes me happy and I want to look back through them later because I think the beginning of the new year is exciting. There's so much freshness and newness and kind of entering with that excitement feels so good. So thank you for sharing. So, in our session today, our goals are for you to leave feeling confident in demonstrating that increased understanding of those behavior supports kind of being integrated through. We like to look at this as not just one more thing, and you'll see that a lot today in our presentation. So, I want you to feel confident in identifying some key practices that support that integrated behavior with that academic, looking at those two as one. And then kind of developing an action plan for making that happen in your context and what that can look like either in your classroom or as you're supporting teachers or students within your school as well. You will be able to find all of our resources. We have a Google Drive folder that has several resources, including a PDF of our presentation today for you. So please, you can do it from the QR code, or I believe we have a link that, yep, just got dropped into the chat. Thank you, Aubrey. So you will find all of the resources we talk about today in that folder for us. So I want you in the chat, I want you to just think for a second, and in the chat, I don't want you to add just a short sentence. It could be a simple sentence. Students learn best when teachers blank. What are some thoughts we have on that? What do we think about that? Listen and ask questions. Very good. Truly have their best interest at heart. Care about their learning. Build healthy relationships. Yes, care. Care about them. Respect them. Oh, I love these. Actively listen. Believe in them. Are firm but fair. Care about them as individuals and make an effort to connect to them personally. What I love most about this is that it is all kind of relationships and that how they feel. You see the how they feel in these responses. That makes me really, that's so powerful. It speaks a lot of volume about what works. And it's not necessarily a lesson plan thing, right? Setting those expectations, staying consistent, even that aligns to how the students feel in that context, right? Asking engaging and relevant questions, believe in them and listen to them. Relationship building. Yes. So I want you to think which of these responses, you don't have to answer, just kind of take it in and think about it. Which of these responses improves academics? which of these improves behavior? And then I think the overarching is, can you separate those two? Right? Yes, Tracy, all. All of these impact both of those. So when we're planning, it's so easy to separate planning for these, but if we look at them together, the same strategies are going to kind of work for both, right? You can't separate them. Exactly. So I want you to take in this quote. I love this quote. It's probably one of my favorites. Just take this in for a second. You can drop a thought in we're open here. Drop a thought in the chat anytime you feel led to, or if you have a thought that kind of goes with this. But just take this in for a second. So, as a intervention teacher, I worked a lot in the academic world, and it was my job to support students in providing them extra support around reading and math, because that's what we do. If a student is struggling with reading, we offer a lot of what? Different avenues for them. We offer a lot of different strategies, right? Like if one thing's not working, we've got a bank of resources we're pulling from. Thinking about swimming, I have a 3-year-old who we're going through swim lessons right now, and we're trying and trying, and we're paying for the lessons. We're going to the pool as much as we can because we want to teach him that. Multiplying, driving, but thinking about the context of a school or a classroom, or even sometimes home. If a student doesn't know how to behave, can we finish that sentence the same in most situations? In my experience, no, right? Our mind goes to punitive because it feels like behavior should be innate, right? But I want this conversation today to think about, and that's the goal of this is thinking about behavior as just as teachable and just as important to teach as that reading and that swimming and all of those other things. I think about sports a lot in this context at a school. Sports teams are huge in schools, right? We want to prep them. And if someone's not doing well, you're continuing to coach them. The same with behavior. And so I think the start with that is the shift in mindset because we think punitive and punish, our mind goes to discipline. But if you look at the definition in the dictionary of discipline itself, it is instruction that corrects, molds or perfects character, and develops self-control. So in our minds and in a lot of schools and in our it's not even just schools, it's the whole system from a top layer. We think of discipline as punitive, but if you really take on what the true meaning of discipline is, it is instruction that corrects. It is teaching what success looks like, and it includes that behavior component. So as we plan a lesson plan, we often ask the question, what do I want students to learn? Right? That's fair. You've got your standards you're aligning to, you've got those learning targets, you've got all these things in the academic world that are pressing on you to teach. Today's session invites you to also ask, not a whole separate thing, but while you're doing this together, also ask the question, wait for it. There we go. What do students need in order to learn it? So it's thinking of these things together, right? Because when you look at them together, what I want them to learn is that academic learning target. But what do they need to learn it is really thinking about how can you embed those behavioral supports into instruction. And I'm really excited because today we're going to show you some ways that really make it easy to do that while you're already planning. Again, not a whole separate process, not like another added layer. It's literally how can you look at those together? So when we're talking about integrated tier one practices, I think it's important to kind of start with talking a little bit about what we mean when we say tier one. Because in schools, we have very rich conversations oftentimes about the tier two and tier three interventions that we're offering, right? When students are struggling and we know they need some additional support, we'll sometimes refer them to receive those additional supports. Tier one, though, it is the platform that is universal for all of your students. It is your good classroom teaching that's happening every day. And that includes that academic and that behavior layer, right? It's really being intentional about what am I doing at tier one to reach all students? Because when they go off and receive that intervention at tier two and tier three, the goal is for them to still be receiving tier one, right? It works for all students. And so it's really just being intentional about designing those practices and those lessons to fit the needs of all of your students at tier one. And I think the what we talked about earlier, the all the feedback y'all gave about a teacher or students can learn best when is pictured right here, right? Those relationships, that's powerful for all students at tier one. Looking at that feedback and being looking at how you're using that feedback to kind of feed them forward in their learning, right? Having those instructional routines. Somebody talked about knowing what the expectations are and following them, having those clear norms and behavior skills and what success looks like, right? And then that positively phrased, kind of really being intentional about the language you're using to show them what does success look like, not having them look at it like rules of what they can't do, but what does it look like to teach what they should do. So thinking about that, tier one is not a place and it's not a program, right? Tier one is what all students experience. And going back again, all of your responses fall right into this perfect tier one responses. That clarity, routines, engagement, that feedback, encouragement, and then giving those opportunities to really be engaged in this. So look at it like tier one is the processing system. Your tier two and your tier three supports are your add-ons. Those are the apps that are going on, but everyone is getting access to that tier one. And then if you think about a lack of tier one, there is a predictable cycle, right? And this is when you're looking at academic and behavior together. Because again, I think everyone in this room knows that behavior impacts academics, academics impacts behavior, right? So lesson isn't designed for engagement and success. I don't even have to read you this cycle. You could all tell me what's going to happen, right? Students become disengaged, they're confused. That then leads to them not being engaged, which leads to them making some poor choices and some contextually inappropriate behaviors, right? That then leads to the teacher needing to spend more time redirecting. That's taking away from the lesson and the teaching. And that's where the frustration comes in, right? And then there's that less instruction time and those positive interactions lessen, then students fall further behind. And it's a vicious cycle. And so that's where we want to introduce the concept. And I say introduce as it's not new, but today give you the tools to intentionally plan to get success around academic and behavior together. So the planning lens in the chat, I want you, and you can think about your teachers, but when you're sitting down to do your lessons, and I know what my answer is here, what is naturally, when you're writing lesson plans or when a teacher's writing lesson plans, what naturally do you think about first? Y'all can pop a couple in the chat or just share out. Standards and engagement, academic standard and indicator. Yep. Standards. I see the needs of students. That's amazing. Clear and understandable for students, engagement, standards. So I know these are student needs, student engagement. These are great answers and they're all over. I know for me, when I first sit down, the first thing I do or I would do is pull out my clipboard that had my standards and my learning targets. From there, other things followed, but I definitely started there naturally. And I see a lot of that as well as the students, and that's so powerful. So thinking through that lens, if we simply add one more planning question. So first, what do you naturally think about? Then how will this lesson, and this is what some of you are doing, I already see it in the chat. So it's just kind of adding on to that. I'm going to give you more tools for that. How will this lesson intentionally support both learning and behavior? It's really thinking about that. And now I'm going to share it over to Ashley to give you some strategies that are going to help. So we're getting you thinking how and thinking with that lens, and she's going to empower you with some amazing tools to help you get there.
Thank you. Okay, let me work on sharing my screen here. All right, thumbs up if you can see that okay. Amazing, thank you. All right, so we talked through tier one practices, and now let's focus on what it truly means to integrate those behavior supports within those tier one practices. So to illustrate this, consider a student who demonstrates the need for increased supports in reading. And perhaps during these reading activities and routines, the student demonstrates consistent patterns of contextually inappropriate behavior because maybe the work is difficult or they perceive it to be challenging or it's confusing. So when that happens, you might need some additional support. So maybe another adult pulls the student to the side of the room or to their office or classroom. And when they do, though well-intentioned, the student may be missing out on that critical tier one reading instruction. and potentially does not yet have the opportunity to demonstrate the expected social behaviors where and when we want them to, like during reading in the classroom, right? So that academic gap continues to widen and they don't yet have that social opportunity. Now think about a student who demonstrates patterns of contextually inappropriate behavior across the school day. And perhaps when they do, they experience exclusionary discipline, like being sent to the office, or suspension, or expulsion. Now, the student is missing out on that critical tier one instruction across the school day. So the academic gap continues to widen, and if that behavior, that contextually inappropriate behavior, is maintained or reinforced by escaping that perceived difficult demand, then we may actually be reinforcing it. And by definition, that means the student may be more likely to continue engaging in that disruptive behavior because they've learned over time that's how they get out of that difficult academic task, right? Well, the reason we know that we can effectively integrate behavior supports in academic routines is because instruction across both areas share the same features. So we can explicitly teach students to demonstrate academic and social behaviors. We can prompt or remind students of those expectations because we've explicitly taught. We're going to actively engage students in relevant opportunities to demonstrate those academic skills and social behaviors. And we'll provide feedback for when they demonstrate those appropriate academic and social behaviors and when they don't yet demonstrate those appropriate behaviors across those areas. Throughout that process, we're going to use different data sources to monitor both our implementation of the practices and student outcome data so that we can make instructional decisions about where we need to adjust. So, what do we mean by explicit instruction in social skills? Well, as a reminder, explicit instruction in general means that we're focusing on a specific skill. So we're identifying what that is. We're going to model or demonstrate what it looks like to engage in that behavior or demonstrate that skill. We're going to practice. So in guided practice, students have lots of opportunities to demonstrate their understanding of the behavior or skill with increased prompts and feedback from the teacher. And then we're going to respond in ways that let students know what we're seeing appropriately, what is not yet appropriately, and that informs what we need to reteach as well. So, an example of what that might look like is for hand raising. Perhaps that's the skill that we're going to focus on. And you're going to model that by showing what it looks like and sounds like to raise your hand appropriately during a specific routine. And then we'll give students opportunities to practice demonstrating that skill and respond when they do and do not yet demonstrate that skill. So let's look at a few different examples across elementary and secondary settings. In an elementary setting, you may connect this skill. So when you introduce that the focus of the lesson is on raising your hand, you might connect that to the social expectation of demonstrating respect in the classroom. So you can talk about why that's so important and how you can engage in collaborative discussions appropriately when you raise your hand. When the teacher models this behavior, they're demonstrating what it looks like and sounds like to know it's time to raise your hand, to wait quietly to be called on, and to share when you are called on. So notice that I pointed out those discrete behaviors because these practice opportunities, or when we're modeling, even before we're practicing, we want to ensure that we're teaching those discrete skills because there are a lot of components to what could seem like a simple behavior of raising our hand, right? We also can include non-examples because for many students, it's just as important to learn what it does not look like as it is to know what it does look like to engage in the appropriate behavior. So then you can have a conversation about how this social behavior of hand raising connects back to respect that we expect to see in the classroom. As you move into guided practice for hand raising, we want to give as many students as possible the opportunity to participate, practice, and demonstrate their understanding of this social behavior. So if you were to choose a topic that many students probably have an opinion on, like what's the best recess game, then you're giving a lot of students the opportunity to wait, raise their hand, wait again, and then share their response. And as students are participating in this guided practice process, you're prompting students to engage in those discrete behaviors and providing feedback. The kind of feedback that's likely to be effective here includes praise, right? So we can say something like, nice job raising your hand, Phoebe, and it's really clear to that student what they demonstrated appropriately. We can also include error corrections that remind students of the expectation. So you might say something in a really neutral tone, like try again, raise your hand first, and then share when I call on you. And now it's clear to the student what that social expectation is. And perhaps you connect that to some kind of group contingency, like a class-wide acknowledgement system. Now, in a secondary setting, this can look really similar, but perhaps you expand on this. So when you introduce the skill and you connect it to respect, you might also talk about how this helps everyone in the classroom feel valued and heard. It encourages thoughtful debate, improves the classroom climate. So you can have those rich discussions depending on the student's skill and age and development in your class. As we move into modeling, perhaps you demonstrate with a student who has a learning history of demonstrating this skill. So you might practice hand raising with a student and they're able to help demonstrate those non-examples of as well. So what does it look like to interrupt or disrupt, and why does that not show respect in the classroom? And you can have a conversation about that. As you move into guided practice, you might consider what the purpose of hand raising is. So, if we teach students to raise their hand to demonstrate respect in the classroom, then perhaps we can put students into small groups and they can work on respectful conversation exchanges with each other. And then you can bring that conversation back to the group and practice hand raising again. While the students are working in those small groups, you're engaging in active circulation around the classroom, active supervision, circulating around so that you can provide those increased prompts for expected behaviors and feedback for students. And the students can engage in reflective practice about how this respectful exchange in information helped them feel respected and potentially helped their peers feel respected as well. We might expand on the way we provide praise in these contexts. So, in addition to you providing specific praise for these behaviors, you might also encourage students to praise each other. So, it might sound something like, hey, thanks for hearing me out first. And you'll include those error corrections too, right? Because we're going to expect that errors are part of the learning process, and that's okay. Paired with that group contingency or other acknowledgement system, you might also include their participation in these explicit social skills lessons in participation grades. Okay, so what we would love to see is this process of prompting expected social behaviors, engaging students in rich and meaningful learning experiences, and responses to appropriate and not yet appropriate behaviors throughout the school day. And what this infographic shows is that we can engage in this continuous process in all different kind of academic instructional routines. So first, I'm going to define each of these teacher behaviors. I'll show some examples, and then we'll look at what this could look like during a specific instructional routine, and we're going to focus on reading. So let's get started with defining behavior prompts. You've explicitly taught the expected social skills, right? And now we're going to remind students of the previously learned social expectation. The key with a prompt is that we deliver it before we expect the student to demonstrate the expected behavior. So we're setting them up for success with a reminder of what we expect to see them demonstrate in that context. And we're specifically naming it. So, for example, if you were to use your class-wide or school-wide matrix to guide your teacher practice, right? And I keep saying teacher practice because a prompt is what we do. That's the teacher practice. So if we connect this to perhaps respect in the cafeteria, and one of the expectations is to give personal space, your prompt might sound something like, okay, your turn to line up, remember personal space. And if an expectation is safe hands, feet, and words to show safety in the classroom, your prompt might sound something like, you can go back to your seat with safe hands and feet now. So it's very clear for students what the expectation is. And you've got a little script here. So you've got reminders for yourself of what kind of language might be most relevant to use with your students. So we're going to remind students of the social expectations in different routines, and then we're going to engage them in multiple and relevant learning opportunities. An opportunity to respond is a teacher behavior, so it's what we do to solicit a content-related response from a student. And I say content related because if your lesson is in a social skill, that's your content. And if your lesson is in science, then your content is science, right? So we engage students in multiple and varied opportunities to respond to increase their participation in learning activities. Now, a common opportunity to respond that we're probably all familiar with is hand raising. So I ask a question to the whole class, students raise their hand to respond. This is very appropriate, meets the definition of an opportunity to respond. And also consider that if the purpose of an opportunity to respond is to increase engagement across all students, and when they're doing that, we're able to progress monitor, think about who's raising their hand. Who's most likely to raise their hand? Same few students, right? And I bet if you can identify who those students are, you're pretty confident they know what the answer is to your question, right? So, if we want to engage all students in the classroom, consider also including these more active opportunities to respond, like picture cards or color cue cards, for example. If there were 4 different colors to indicate answers for A, B, C, and D, and students could hold up their response. Or if we did activities like think, pair, share, or turn and talk, these can be beneficial for a couple reasons. First, it builds in some wait time, especially with a think, pair, share. Secondly, the students may be more likely to participate in those partnerships or small groups than by sharing to the whole group. And as the students are engaged in these turn and talks and other cooperative learning opportunities, you're able to engage in that active supervision again and progress monitor and add to those conversations. So as you can see, we've included hand raising here, certainly an appropriate opportunity to respond in many contexts. You can also think about having students engage in written responses or working together. Maybe they're identifying characters in a book, or you can engage in turn-taking activities with students. They might play games and act out scenarios, or you could incorporate technology. So we want to be thinking about ways to increase student participation in the learning activities. So we're going to prompt or remind students to engage in the expected social behaviors. We're going to provide many opportunities to respond, and then we are going to respond to their appropriate and not yet appropriate behaviors. And in this context, in a school, we're going to focus on reinforcement. And by definition, reinforcement increases the future likelihood of the student demonstrating that behavior under a similar circumstance. And reinforcement is more likely to be effective than these other punitive responses because the student then has a clear indicator of the appropriate behavior. So we're shifting our focus away from what they're not yet demonstrating appropriately, and all the focus is on what they have demonstrated appropriately because we've prompted it and we're letting them know we want to see it again. So you might add a praise statement. They might earn extra recess or a sticker or some other kind of token economy. They could earn extra technology or maybe a break in a beanbag chair or otherwise. And we're going to focus on praise for a couple of reasons. First, we know that many student behaviors in schools are reinforced or maintained by adult attention. So when they like your attention, they're more likely to engage in similar behavior to earn your praise again. Also, praise is readily available. We can deliver praise statements wherever we are without additional resources. General praise is really great for the classroom environment. It creates a positive space, right? So when we're saying things like good job, great, way to go, and behavior specific praise is more likely to serve as a reinforcer for appropriate behavior because it specifically names the behavior that the student demonstrated. And it's contingent, meaning that we deliver that praise statement as soon as the student demonstrates that behavior. So, for example, they stand up and push in their chair. Great job pushing in your chair. They raise their hand. Nice job raising your hand. So, that praise phrase with the behavior delivered contingently. Now, we mentioned earlier that we know students will demonstrate errors as part of this learning process. And rather than punish those errors, we want to anticipate them and plan for them. So we'll neutrally deliver error corrections that serve as instructional reminders. So, for example, you might say something like, remember to push in your chair after the student walks away from it. So it's just an instructional reminder of what we want to see instead. Now, you see that ratio and weight in the bottom left as a reminder that the goal is 5 praise statements for every error correction. So we're giving more praise to students than we are correcting behavior. And when I first started learning to build fluency in behavior specific praise, I just started with adding anything onto that praise statement. So if you find yourself saying a lot of good job, great, way to go, that's a really good start. Practice by adding anything onto it. Good job, what? Just look around the room. Good job putting your pencil down. Nice job looking at me. Great waiting. Just add something onto it, and you'll start to build fluency with using behavior specific praise. All right, so let's look at this process across different settings. We'll start with secondary, then look at elementary. A pre-correction is a specific type of prompt where you're anticipating the potential error. So if students are typically on their phones, we can anticipate that error and provide a prompt before they demonstrate that error. For example, as students transition into the classroom, you might say, good morning, phones away before you sit down. And now the students have a reminder of exactly what to demonstrate. So we've set them up for success. We're going to engage them in multiple and varied opportunities to respond. In this case, they're working together. And you can connect your praise statement to the behavior expectation that you prompted. So if you prompted students to put their phones away so that they were more likely to, your praise might sound something like, nice job working with your phones away. And if the students find praise reinforcing, they're more likely to continue engaging in that expected behavior. All right, let's take a look in an elementary setting. It's a really similar process. Perhaps you have a student who is so excited to share their learning and you want to set that student up for success. So before they call out, you'll remind the student of the expected behavior. Remember to raise your hand to share respectfully. And then we'll engage the student in opportunities to respond. And this written response is more likely to include multiple students in the room, right, who can all draw their responses. And we can connect our praise statements to the prompt that we delivered. So if we prompted the student to raise their hand, so they did, we can praise with a statement like, thanks for raising your hand, tell me about your picture. Now we've reinforced that behavior potentially by using behavior specific praise. And the student is learning that's how I get my teacher's attention, by raising my hand. Calling out doesn't work, but raising my hand does. Okay, so what does it look like to intentionally plan this? Well, I had the good fortune of working with a full team of researchers from UConn to train and coach elementary school teachers to integrate these behavior supports within their reading instruction. So we're going to look at this process of including prompts, opportunities to respond, and praise and error corrections in a specific reading routine. And you could think about how this would generalize across other content areas as well. We used a specific evidence-based program called Enhanced Core Reading Instruction, or ECRI, and we chose that because of its evidence basis and also because it's built, there's elements of explicit instruction built right in and multiple opportunities to respond. So what we did to embed these practices was think about when you introduce the academic skill, what are you also introducing as that behavioral focus? Then, as teachers move into the modeling part of the lesson, they're prompting students to engage in the expected academic and social behavior. They're engaging the student, which during modeling, we might expect active listening as engagement. And they are providing praise for engaging in those expected social behaviors, in this case, during modeling. As the teacher moved into guided practice, we provided another prompt for how to participate in that part of the routine. So then we used whole group opportunities to respond. So a lot of choral responses. And the teachers provided praise based on students demonstrating these appropriate academic and social behaviors. Then, as we shift into the independent practice part of the academic routine, the teacher provided a brief prompt for the academic and social behavior. They engaged the students, so with individual turns for opportunities to respond and what it looks like and sounds like to wait your turn. And they provided praise for engaging in those expected academic and social behaviors. So, this continuous process was within one reading routine. There was also a group contingency built in. So during this lesson closure, the students earned points throughout for demonstrating appropriate social behavior. So they might earn something like a dance party at the end of reading. To set the students, or excuse me, the teachers up for success, we built in some prompt statements, some opportunities to respond, and praise statements and error corrections that the teachers could use. So that as they built fluency with integrating behavior supports in the academic routine, they had some go-to phrases and they could read it from a script if that was helpful. Now, you don't need a full research team to do this. In fact, you could take post-it notes so that you have clear reminders in your program book or in a notepad or on your desk about the type of prompts that you want to provide to your students, opportunities to respond that would be relevant for that instructional routine, and some praise statements that you could use, as well as potentially some error corrections. And now you've got go-to phrases. In the resource folder, you also have access to a blank integrated lesson plan template. And again, you don't really need to script out a full lesson, but it may be really helpful as you start to think about what it looks like and sounds like for you to integrate these practices in different routines, whether that's an academic routine or you're working on a functional skill or a specific social behavior. So you'll identify the specific routine, think about the behavioral skills that you want to focus on during that routine, and then write out or think about what it's going to look like and sound like to prompt or remind students to engage them in those opportunities to respond and to praise and reinforce. And you'll do that throughout that full instructional routine. Okay, so you may be thinking, this is going to work for most of my students. I understand how this process could be effective, but I've got some students who will require more intensive supports. So we looked at that too. We recently did a study where we worked with teachers in inclusive settings for students who do and do not experience a disability, and we trained them to intentionally intensify these three key practices: behavior prompts, opportunities to respond, and specific praise. We also trained the teachers to self-monitor their own behavior. So the intervention included them monitoring their implementation of these teacher practices. And what we learned is that when the teachers implemented this intervention with fidelity or as intended, we saw increased academic engagement for the student who experienced a disability and their peers, and decreased contextually inappropriate behavior or off-task behavior across the students who experience a disability and their peers. So what does it look like or sound like to intentionally intensify or to adjust these practices? Well, remember, we're thinking in a tier one context, but we can still differentiate the way that we use these teacher practices. So when we're prompting, if we have a student who requires more intensive academic or social supports, we want to think about what those specific skills are so we can increase our prompts in that area. So you might be thinking, I really need to increase my prompts during math class because that's when I see the most consistent contextually inappropriate behaviors. Or you might be thinking, I really need to increase my prompts for waiting because that's the skill that we really want to focus on with this student. You also may want to individualize. So when we prompt the entire class, we might also want to add in an individual prompt for a specific student, or pair it with a visual, or use a proximity prompt where we're standing closer to the student so that we can provide those additional supports. When we think about accessible opportunities to respond, remember all of you said, or so many people said, that you're working on building those really rich relationships with students. So, because you're learning about their strengths and interests and preferences, we can include those in our curriculum and our materials and our activities so that students are more likely to be engaged and participate in that learning process. And we can ensure that our opportunities to respond are relevant and meaningful because they're aligned with the student's skills and behaviors. They're appropriately challenging, and they make sense for the context of the classroom or that school community. When we think about behavior specific praise, we talked about a ratio of 5 to 1. And there's research to suggest that we want to increase that ratio to as much as 9 to 1 for students who experience a disability. So 9 praise statements for every error correction. And that sounds like a lot, but go back to that practice of just adding something on to what you're probably already doing with those great statements of like, good job, great way to go. We also might think of pairing behavior specific praise with other relevant reinforcers, potentially aligned with behavior function if we know what that is because the student has a behavior support plan. So, how do you get started? Well, you can think about prioritizing one routine. So, going into a new school year, think back on your experiences. What is a time of day or a specific routine that students typically demonstrate the need for increased behavior supports? That's perhaps where we want to start with integrating these practices. And we want to ensure that they are relevant, meaning they're accessible for all students, and they're going to make sense for whatever context you're planning them for. So, for example, you might not be planning opportunities to respond during an arrival routine, but maybe your focus is going to be on prompting expected behaviors as students transition into the classroom. We also want to ensure that our practices are accessible for all students. So, are we pairing visuals? Are we ensuring that students have access to their AAC devices? Are we including other relevant supports like maybe fine motor tools if we have a written OTR? So, we're thinking about ensuring that these are accessible for each and every student in the classroom. So we went through the template, the reading lesson plan that shows how you could potentially script these in. And we showed the blank lesson plan. And next, I want to orient you to an action plan that's going to invite you to think about what priority routine you want to start with and what it might look and sound like to provide those prompts that are accessible to all of your students to engage in those opportunities to respond, and then what your responses are going to be, including behavior specific praise, maybe what you pair with that as reinforcement, and also potentially the error corrections that you'll want to include. Okay, so we're going to explicitly teach social skills and behaviors. And then we're going to remind students what we expect them to demonstrate during these academic or functional routines. We're going to use opportunities to respond to actively engage students and promote that on-task behavior. And we're going to provide contingent feedback, including a focus on behavior-specific praise with error corrections as needed. And I mentioned that we're going to use data to monitor and adjust. If you have some way to visually analyze your data, so let's say you've got some kind of program where you could see a graph of your data or other visual representation, that could give you a clear indicator about how you either want to adjust what practices you're focusing on or how you're implementing them. But you also could use anecdotal evidence. Look at your notes and think about your observations of your students. And that might give you information about where you want to make intentional adjustments about these practices that you're likely already implementing. So let's put it all together. When we intentionally integrate behavior supports within these tier 1 practices, we're setting students and ourselves up for success because we're reminding students of exactly the social behaviors we want to see. We're promoting on-task behavior because students are engaged in those learning opportunities, and they're more likely to continue demonstrating these appropriate social behaviors when we reinforce with behavior-specific praise statements. That's going to also increase our instructional time. So, whereas you might be thinking, oh, I'm not sure I have time to explicitly teach social skills with everything you have jam-packed into your day, But if you consider the fact that you're likely already spending the time stuck in a cycle of response, we can put that effort into a proactive approach. And now we're more likely to see that long-term appropriate social behaviors. So we looked at tier one universal practices, and to really effectively integrate these practices, we're going to remind students of exactly what we expect to see across different contexts because we have explicitly taught what it looks like and sounds like to engage in these social behaviors. And because we've developed strong relationships with the students, we're going to use what we know about their strengths, interests, and preferences to plan activities and reinforcement strategies. And we're going to provide that feedback, including praise and those reinforcement strategies, along with the error corrections that serve as instructional reminders of the kind of social behaviors that we want to see in classrooms. So I am thrilled to be learning with you all today and happy to take questions. So I think we can pause here for questions. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can see everyone.